The phantom nobleman stood erect, in his cream-colored satin attire, complete with matching gloves and handkerchief, a crimson topcoat with gold trim fashioned from the finest velvet, and a pair of glistening black leather riding boots, watching as the party-goers came and went from the attic window of what used to be his family's villa, but had since been converted to servants' quarters. While he still enjoyed a bit of gaiety now and again, he simply refused to set foot in that modern-day brick travesty which now stood in place of his centuries-old mansion. His contract, spanning more than 250 years, clearly stated that he could stay on as long as the property remained unoccupied or its new owners extended an invitation within 60 days of taking possession. He'd managed to strong-arm all of the preceding owners, mercilessly terrorized them in their beds every night until they either surrendered or fled. But not this time. This couple had 4 kids, and there was no scenario in which he could see them yielding their land or freely extending an invitation to the likes of him. The snazzy aristocrat had 54 days left to articulate a plan, or he would silently fade away into the night, simply cease to exist. Despite the inevitable staring him in the face, he would never concede. He'd think of something, because his life was in no way synonymous with that Dylan Thomas poem. He would not go gentle into that good night. Not for the second time. He'd been forced to endure it once, and the entire affair was just a tribulation. Nana raised a glass in honor of her son and daughter-in-law, to Jordan and Phyllis Weston, the proud new owners of this beautiful estate. "Hear, hear," everyone agreed. It was the holiday weekend, and a packed house for the dinner party/housewarming at the Weston estate. Jordan and Phyllis were now the proud owners of a charming 5-bed, 5.5-bath brick ranch nestled on 50 acres of farmland in Franklin, New York. The property also boasted a newly erected greenhouse, a guest house, servants' quarters, and a barn. It was roughly an hour's drive from Midtown Manhattan, a huge selling point for Jordan, who worked as a stockbroker on Wall Street. The couple chose to get out of the city because of their 5-year-old quadruplets, Ethan, Eric, Emily, and Emma. The kids were growing up fast and needed to have their own yard to run around and play. A safe environment where Phyllis wouldn't have to worry over some sick twist plotting to snatch one of them up and run off every time she batted an eye. The icing on the cake, as they say, is that the kids would have their Nana with them every day. Jordan's mother, now a widow, would live in their guest house. She'd lost her husband less than a year ago and needed to be closer to her family, especially her grandchildren. Phyllis tucked the kids in and headed off to the kitchen to help her mother-in-law with the dishes. The kids waited until they were sure that the coast was clear, then gathered their flashlights and backpacks and slipped out the window on a quest to explore every nook and cranny of their new home. The broody apparition was green with envy as he watched those poorly dressed little urchins escape through their bedroom window and traverse his property. The snoops were already sticking their nose in where they didn't belong, and he intended to teach them a lesson. They would pee their pants and run home crying for their mother by the time he was done with them. He casually glided through the top-story window out into the night to see what the 4 little terrorists were getting up to. But before he could home in on them, he spotted a green pickup truck half a mile down the road and went to investigate. He watched as it backed under a thatch of hedges and parked, saw 3 men exit the vehicle and begin their trek towards the estate. This didn't bode well with the noble. No gentleman would come calling at this hour, and certainly not while the master of the house was away. These ruffians were obviously up to no good, had most likely lain in wait for the perfect opportunity to strike. He suddenly felt duty-bound to defend the Weston household. Master Jordan had gone not 30 minutes before, leaving the women folk and those kids alone, something that didn't matter in the least to the chivalrous apparition, because this was technically still his estate, which made them all his guests. So those 3 rapscallions would deal with him, and they would rue the day that they trespassed on his land and insulted his guests. The kids entered the barn minutes ahead of the 3 thieves who had crossed the threshold of their property on the northern end, farthest from the main house, then decided to hold up in the barn until the house was dark and everyone asleep. Startled by the men's voices just outside, Emily and Emma went one way, while Ethan and Eric went the other, in search of a place to hide. The girls huddled in a corner at the farthest end of the barn where it was so dark that they couldn't even see their hands in front of their faces. As long as they remained perfectly still and completely quiet, no one would know they were there. The barn door creaked open and 3 men quietly slipped inside. A terrified Emma started to cry, and Emily placed a hand over her mouth to stifle the sound, lest they be discovered by the intruders. But it was too late. One of the men flicked his lighter and moved in their direction. Ethan and Eric had managed to circle around behind the men, were crouching down alongside the wall nearest the door. When the 2 men turned to follow their ringleader, the boys slipped out of the barn and ran up to the house to tell their mom. The men were close enough to reach out and grab the girls when the Phantom Lord revealed himself by lighting up the entire barn and then strategically placing himself between the girls and the thugs. He winked at Emily and Emma, then turned to face his opponents and declared, "You, sirs, are no gentlemen." The loathing in his tone was indicative of the warning that followed. "Leave now, or I'll be forced to teach you some manners." "Is this a joke?" their ringleader countered, looking back at his 2 accomplices who were suddenly apprehensive. His idiocy, compounded by a total lack of decency, further incensed the already livid entity. He politely removed one of his leather gloves, slapped him across the face with it, and shouted through clenched teeth, "How dare you attack defenseless children?" Ethan and Eric were hysterical by the time they made it back to the house. They babbled and pointed and desperately tried to explain. Phyllis' heart skipped a beat when she saw the bright light. She didn't even give the boys a chance to explain. She just tore out in the direction of the barn. Her legs couldn't carry her fast enough. The thought of her girls burning alive was too much to bear. When she burst into the barn with the boys and her mother-in-law in tow, a hodgepodge of emotions watched over her. She was relieved to see that the girls weren't being burned alive, horrified by the 3 intruders, perplexed by the ghostly figure floating in midair, and intrigued once it registered in her mind that the light was emanating from him. The outraged apparition surged forward and grabbed the leader of the pack by the throat. He then lifted him up off his feet and threw him into the other 2 men, who'd been slowly backing away in a quiet attempt to escape. The trio landed in a heap, and he was on them before they could recover. He tossed the lot of them out into the night, then chased them off the western estate. Satisfied to have dispatched those worthless louts, the rowdy aristocrat returned to his guests, bowed, and introduced himself. "My name, Messieurs and Mesdames, is Lord Byron." Phyllis and Nana shot each other a look. "Not that Lord Byron," he explained behind a smirk. "I'm the other Lord Byron." Emily and Emma ran into their mother's arms, pleading, "Mom, can we keep him? Can we, please?" Phyllis was so grateful that she didn't even think twice. "Of course we can keep him. He can stay with us as long as he likes. He's one of the family now." She had tears in her eyes when she turned to him and silently mouthed, "Thank you." Nana smiled and gave her nod of approval. The kids, one after the other, ran up to the noble and said, "Good night, Lord Byron." He stood erect, chin raised, chest poked out, bursting with pride. He'd met his contractual obligations and gained a family in the process. He glided up to the main house and watched as Phyllis tucked those kids in. He found little Emily and Emma positively adorable. For the first time in a long time, his presence in the earth had meaning. The world was a much more dangerous place than when he was alive. His sole purpose now was to keep those kids safe, and by God, he would do just that, come hell or high water.